Right after we left the safe house, then we came down and was dropped off on the other side of the triple underpass. And we checked back over this way. We spotted the Grassy Knoll on the north side. Next logical shot.
I don't know if we will ever know how many shooters there were. My investigation shows that Johnny Roselli was there, Chuck Nicoletti was there, James Fowles was there.
I'm fixing to lose my fill of fire. And at this point, either I shoot or I can put it in a suitcase and leave, one or the other. I took the shot. I fired one shot only.
John F. Kennedy was the first American president born in the 20th century. A highly educated man, Kennedy had a grasp of geopolitics and finance that far surpassed most modern American presidents. He also began to address a number of problem areas that had previously been considered off limits to his predecessors.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Kennedy's problems with the CIA began immediately after his inauguration, when he approved a plan already in the works to invade Cuba. The CIA predicted Cuba would rise up against Fidel Castro, but instead the venture proved a bitter failure.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Cuban Army pilots opened the first phase of organized revolt with bombing raids on 3 military bases. 2 of the B-26 light bombers then seek asylum in Florida. On the heels of the air raids, landings were effected by rebels at several places on the Cuban coast, and the rebellion against the red-tinged dictator was on, with the refugee pilot claiming a full-scale army revolt near. In Havana, acting Foreign Minister Olivares shows diplomats rockets fired from the Cuban raiders, which he claims have U.S. marking. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Cuban Foreign Minister Roa accused the United States of unleashing a war of invasion. Roa said,
In 1961, when it became apparent to the world that the Bay of Pigs invasion was a thinly disguised attempt by the U.S. to invade Cuba, Kennedy declined to use the full weight of American military might, angering the hawks within the Pentagon and CIA.
CIA, unchecked, no checks and balances on them, basically ran their own ship, didn't answer to anybody, and Kennedy, at that time, was about to disband them. He wasn't happy with the Bay of Pigs. He wasn't happy with all the operations they had going to kill Castro. He was rather embarrassed by some of the operations they had going. He fired Dulles, and he fired General Cabell, and strangely enough, the mayor of Dallas, Texas, is General Cabell's brother.
Kennedy was also having second thoughts on our involvement in Vietnam. Soon after taking office, he had been confronted with a crisis in the Southeast Asian nation of Laos, where the communist Pathet Lao were fighting against the CIA-sponsored General Phu Novosan. As in the Bay of Pigs invasion, all of Kennedy's advisors, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, urged him to send in U.S. troops. But again, he declined.
So you have the military against him. Johnson and Kennedy hated each other.
Just prior to his death, Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, which effectively called for the return of all U.S. troops from Vietnam by the end of 1965. Kennedy's disengagement orders were countermanded days after his assassination by this security memorandum authorized by his successor, Lyndon Johnson. The initial draft of this order was dated November 21, 1963, a time when Kennedy was in Texas and the day before he arrived in Dallas.
Not only are you looking at things getting tight for CIA, you're looking at things getting tight for the mafia, you're looking at Bobby Kennedy going after him.
I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time. I think a lot of steps can be taken in order to deal with the problem. I think it's gotten much more serious over the period of the last 10 years.
Robert Kennedy was pursuing organized crime with a vengeance. He launched a crusade which was on the verge of annihilating the mafia. Thousands of mafia members were either in jail, under indictment, or under such close surveillance that they could barely operate. The mob would not have been around much longer if the Kennedys had been allowed to continue their work.
So who did it? Well, I can throw another one in. He's going to get rid of J. Edgar Hoover if he is reelected in 1964, and Hoover knows that. He's mandatory retirement time. What does Johnson do after he gets in the White House but give him a permanent deferment to the day he dies? He could be director if he lives to be 150. So you got all these people that don't like Kennedy.
You know, you talk about conspiracy, you talk about how could it last for 40 years without somebody in the conspiracy saying anything.
Former Special Agent Zach Sheldon was an agent who worked under my supervision. He called me and presented to me the stage of the investigation on Kennedy assassination that he had been conducting independently. It was quite obvious from our conversation that Zach had the investigators' fire for the investigation, which to a certain degree concerned me. And I wanted Zach, and I told him at this time, to kind of step back and don't let your emotions run, but hold yourself as the investigator and let the information, facts flow.
I entered on duty with the FBI in 1970 and became an agent in 1973, where I went to Kansas City, Missouri, then Chicago, Illinois, and then the Houston Division. When I was in Kansas City and Chicago, my main investigative duties was on the Organized Crime Squad. Since retiring in 1998 from the FBI, I have spent a lot of time investigating the Kennedy assassination.
Why do we want to open up this sore again? Has there not been enough, Zach? Facts, warrant commission, books written, documentaries written. What makes your information so different and unique than what has previously been presented? We then decided at this time that Zach must convince me, as the old supervisor, that there was sufficient information here where I would authorize an investigation, meaning predication, a purpose. Why spend the effort?
The 1960 election between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon was extremely close. The victory was ensured by Mayor Daley's machine in Chicago, and the overwhelming margin provided in Chicago's First Ward, which was under the control of the Chicago Crime Syndicate, led by Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana.
The husband of Antoinette Giancana, a good friend of mine and colleague, her name, of course, is on the book here. The husband is a man named Bob McDonald, who was Sam Giancana's good friend and also his lawyer. Bob McDonald was the one that introduced Sam Giancana to Father Joseph Patrick Kennedy in Judge Tuohy's office. Judge Tuohy was a well-known judge in Chicago. So Sam Giancana was told by Father Kennedy, "You helped to elect my son, John F. Kennedy, for the presidency, and we will go easy on your operation." So Giancana did a great deal to make sure about John Kennedy's election. For example, in the first ward that he had control over, it was 79% for Kennedy. In the 27th ward, that he also had great control of, it was 85%. That's opposed to a 66% average voter turnout for Kennedy.
Basically, Joe Kennedy promised the mob the White House. You elect my son, and the White House is yours. Well, what did? They thought they elected his son because Illinois is the one that flipped it in West Virginia. Well, who flipped it in Illinois? None other but Chicago. And they felt like they got Kennedy elected. So when Bobby steps in, they felt betrayed.
Bobby Kennedy, of course, was Attorney General, and he decided that he would make his name going after the mob. And he certainly did. And then Sam Giancana had this lockstep surveillance. Even when he went to the bathroom, there was somebody going to the bathroom with him, namely an FBI agent. This was not a good idea, to double-cross the mafia.
Carlos Marcello, the crime boss of New Orleans, became the target of Robert Kennedy's war on crime when he was unceremoniously dumped into the jungles of Guatemala, where he had to endure several days of hardship while fighting for his life before making it back into the United States. FBI Special Agent Michael Wax spent much of his time in New Orleans working undercover on the Marcello case and provides invaluable insight regarding Marcello's anger at the Kennedys.
During our time with Mr. Marcello, which was quite extensive, he made reference to his problems in the past with the Kennedy family. Anytime there was a mention of the Kennedy family or the Kennedy administration, he would get extremely violent about it, would go into a tirade over what had happened to him at the hands of specifically Robert Kennedy, who was then Attorney General.
In the spring and summer of 1963, according to credible federal witnesses, 3 major mafia figures were all discussing plots to kill John and Robert Kennedy, John or Robert. Carlos Marcello, mafia boss of New Orleans, spoke about killing President Kennedy. Santos Traficante, mafia boss of Tampa, predicted that Kennedy would be killed. And Jimmy Hoffa, who was the Teamster boss, who was close with both Traficante and Marcello, is asking an FBI informant to procure some explosives to murder Robert Kennedy.
In addition, the mafia stood to lose millions when Castro kicked them out of Cuba and ended what could be called Cuba's role as a client state for the mob.
And Sam Giancana, he had a multi-million-dollar shrimp industry, a number of hotels and casinos in Havana. All of it was lost thanks to the Bay of Pigs. And so he blamed Kennedy, of course, as many people have, for the disasters of the Bay of Pigs, when he lost many millions of dollars.
The CIA, Cuban refugees, and organized crime began a strange union to try to assassinate the Cuban leader Fidel Castro.
Prior to November 22nd, 1963, the mob were in bed with CIA. Years before, they connected through a guy by the name of Robert Mayhew, who was a retired FBI agent, that put the Chicago mob together with the CIA and came up with the operation to kill Castro.
Chauncey Holt's links to organized crime go back to the late 1930s when he met future crime boss Peter Licavoli. Chauncey Holt's expertise and value for the mob began after the Second World War, when he served as a bookkeeper for mob boss Meyer Lansky. Holt, through his links with organized crime, became involved in the shadowy world of the CIA.
Of the plans that they had, the one that ended up with Mongoose was the most ridiculous of all, in which they decided they would use organized crime, feeling, I guess, that organized crime is skillful at that sort of thing. They may be certain types of assassination they're good at, but other types they're not. So they enlisted, the better-known names, Giancana, Rosselli, in Operation Mongoose. We had Edward Lansdale and William King Harvey, all the guys who later became legend, and there's no use to expound on their career. that got involved in this.
When you speak of the mob, they're one and the same as far as the CIA at that particular time.
The course of the entire nation changed when gunshots rang out in Dallas. The accounts of the assassination varied depending on where people stood in the plaza. Many people near Houston Street said shots came from the area of the Texas School Book Depository, a private company that warehoused school textbooks for a number of publishers. However, over 75% of the bystanders in the plaza said shots came from a slope, which came to be known as the Grassy Knoll, located north of the Triple Underpass in Dallas. In fact, the Grassy Knoll was where many bystanders rushed immediately following the shots which hit Kennedy. Those between these two locations, such as World War II combat veteran A.J. Milliken, reported shots from both directions.
At this point, it looks as though it could have been one or two or even all of the people within the car may have been the victims, may have been struck by shots. We don't know. I'm pulling in now toward Parkland Hospital, coming to the approach. An officer waving me down. He's waving me around. There's a cordon. There's already a cordon of police officers running from their cars.
When the gunfire ended, the president was rushed to nearby Parkland Hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after 1 p.m. Acting Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff indicated the fatal shot entered his boss's right temple.
It's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
Meanwhile, back in Dealey Plaza, attention was directed to the Texas School Book Depository, where a rifle and spent cartridges were found on the 6th floor.
Shots apparently came from the 5th floor of the Texas Bookstore Depository building, possibly from an automatic cut weapon. Police were looking for a young white man dressed in a white shirt with Levi's.
Within an hour of the Kennedy assassination, a young ex-Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for slipping in a South Dallas movie theater without paying. But police obviously had more serious charges in mind. As they hauled Oswald from the theater, some were heard to shout, "Kill the president, will you?" Oswald himself seemed fearful of being killed. He shouted to bystanders, "I am not resisting arrest." Upon arrival at the Dallas police station more than an hour and a half after the assassination, it was discovered that the man police had arrested had two sets of identification, one in the name of Lee Harvey Oswald and another for Alec James Heidel. Chauncey Holt's duties included the making of false identifications for the CIA, at which he was considered an expert.
We did false identifications, a number of false identifications that ended up in the hands of authorities. We did other IDs for Oswald in both his name and Heidel, some of which, as far as I know, never ended up in anybody's. What happened to them, we don't know.
Jay Bartell is a longtime friend and associate of Chauncey Holt. Bartell worked with Holt on many operations and can verify his connections with the CIA.
He was associated with people that I believe and he believed were definitely connected with the death of the president.
The immediate aftermath of the assassination of John F. Kennedy was fraught with lies and inconsistencies that raised more questions than answers.
Hoover found out almost immediately after the assassination, of course, that it occurred, and so he called Robert Kennedy out at Hickory Hill. Kennedy was having a crime conference out there. He informed Robert Kennedy that the president had been shot and that I think he had been seriously wounded, and he said he'd call back when he got more information, and then he called back a short time later and simply informed Robert Kennedy very casually, very coolly that the president was dead. And that was the end of the conversation. And after that, from that time on, he would not deal with Robert Kennedy directly, just essentially dismissed him after that. Morning after the assassination, he presented Lyndon Johnson with a highly biased report that had very selective data in it that just simply was designed to implicate Oswald. Even before Oswald was even charged with anything, Friday afternoon, a few hours after the assassination, before Kennedy's body even arrived in Washington, Hoover had already dictated an internal memo, in essence saying that Oswald was guilty.
The president's body was forcibly removed from Parkland Hospital in Dallas by the Secret Service and taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, where an autopsy would be performed that evening, Friday, 22 November 1963, by two naval officers who had no previous experience with gunshot victims.
Two FBI special agents, James Seibert and Francis O'Neill, are assigned to witness the autopsy of John F. Kennedy. What they see will contradict the findings of the Warren Commission.
James Seibert was a supervisory special agent at Hyattsville, Maryland, when I was transferred there in '63. James Seibert was the type of agent I wanted to be.
I got on the phone and Tully said that he had just received information from Bureau headquarters that we were to get in the motorcade, follow the motorcade all the way up to Bethesda where the autopsy was going to be done, witness the autopsy, and hand carry any bullets that might have been removed from the body over to the laboratory to preserve the chain of evidence. Those were our instructions. During this autopsy, we made notes.
Based on these agents' testimony, when the body was unwrapped, there was no clothes. In order to do an autopsy properly, you need to be conversing with people that have the clothes, or the best is the fact that the clothes are there with the body.
Had they had that information available to them, they would have been aware that the jacket and the shirt both displayed a hole about 5.5 inches below the collar, a location which is also reflected on a diagram of the body subject to the autopsy by J. Thornton Boswell, who was assisting James Humes in conducting the inquiry.
Also, these agents stated that at no time did the doctors at Bethesda call or touch base with the doctors at Parkland Hospital to see if there was anything they needed to know and what was done as far as trying to save Kennedy's life. These two agents basically observed a shot to the back, upper back of Kennedy that entered the body, approximately 5.5 inches below the neckline and approximately 2 inches to the right of the spine. There was no entry wound to the neck.
Several weeks later, the doctors in Dallas were presented with the autopsy report, which said that there was no entry wound to the throat. Actually, the autopsy doctors did not see that wound. They claimed that because the tracheotomy had been made horizontally through the wound, that they did not see any sign of an entry wound to the throat. They claimed instead that there was a shot that went through Kennedy's upper back or lower neck and that it exited through the throat. But they didn't actually see any evidence for that in the throat. They did see an entry wound in the back, but they were not able to track it more than a very short distance. In their examination, it was a shallow wound that really didn't go anywhere.
This particular wound to the back never penetrated the body. In fact, upon probing the wound only went approximately 2 inches into the body and quit. There was enough concern about this as to where the bullet is or why can't we find an exit wound that Agent Jim Seibert went to the phone and called an agent in the firearms unit of the FBI in the lab, Agent Killian, and discussed with them the probability of an ice bullet because they had a wound with no exit and they couldn't find the bullet. Agent Killian said, "I think I can solve your problem because a Secret Service agent just brought a bullet in that was found on Kennedy's stretcher at Parkland Hospital, not Conley's stretcher.
Doctors in Dallas and at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, D.C., gave conflicting descriptions of Kennedy's wounds. Dallas doctors all reported a massive hole in the right rear portion of Kennedy's head. The Washington, D.C. doctors described the hole near the top of the head.
There is an ongoing conflict between what the Dallas doctors saw and reported versus what the autopsy doctors in Bethesda, Maryland saw and reported.
In Dallas, Oswald was proclaiming his innocence at every opportunity.
Oswald, did you shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, sir. I haven't been told what I'm here for. Do you have a lawyer? No, sir, I don't.
He even claimed to be a patsy, one who has been set up to take the blame for the real culprits.
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I live in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
There he comes. Now the prisoner
The case would take a bizarre turn 3 days later when Lee Harvey Oswald was himself assassinated by a small-time hood from Chicago by the name of Jack Ruby.
Officer, he's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. Where's the man with a gun?
Jack Ruby was a associate member of organized crime back in the 30s and 40s and early 50s in Chicago. Jack Ruby got involved in narcotics transactions, which were strictly forbidden by Chicago organized crime. And he was set to be hit. They were going to whack him. Somebody interceded for him, which was Eddie Vogel, and rather than kill him, they just moved him, banished him from Chicago, and moved him out to Dallas through several other places. I think that he had spent some time in New Orleans, and I believe that he also spent some time in Tampa, Florida, before he ended up in Dallas, Texas.
Prior to the assassination, Ruby, I wouldn't by no means call him a mafia boss. I wouldn't maybe put him in the top 5 in the Dallas mob hierarchy, but he was definitely a mid-level, significant mobster. He's a frequent associate of Joe Civillo, the mafia boss of Dallas. He's close contact of Joe Campisi, the mafia underboss of Dallas. Witnesses describe him running a string of gambling operations. To do gambling in Dallas, you had to get it cleared through Jack Ruby. There's a witness, an FBI report from 1956, among many others, that describes Ruby as a significant figure in narcotics operations. Again, you had to run a narcotics operation in this case, they had to clear it with Jack Ruby. This witness was re-interviewed after the assassination events. She confirmed, yes, no question, that was Jack Ruby. The first clue to the mob's involvement in the Kennedy assassination is Jack Ruby's phone records. You look through his phone records, and this is something I did and the House Select Committee did, and you find many, many matches between his phone calls in 1963 and notorious mob figures around the country. And what's interesting is you look at the rate of his out-of-state calls. In January 1963, it's a very low rate. You come up to the week before the assassination, and the rate is 25-fold what it was in January. And then, when we get to the final days before the assassination, no telephone calls. All of a sudden, people are coming in and meeting Jack Ruby in Dallas. The night before the assassination, Ruby saw Joe Campisi. After Ruby shoots Oswald and gets in jail, who visits him? On November 30th, according to police records, again, Joe Campisi, mafia underboss of Dallas, comes to visit Jack Ruby in jail.
Jack Ruby gave clear clues to his role in the assassination when he was interviewed on camera.
The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people that had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
Jack Ruby said he would reveal the true story of the Kennedy assassination if he was moved from Dallas to Washington, D.C. for protection. Ruby feared for his life if he testified in Dallas, but no transfer to Washington, D.C. was ever authorized by federal authorities.
Jack, what do you think about the hearing? I want to correct what I stated before. He was vice president. Remember I said he was vice president? Yes, I did when I mentioned about Adlai Stevens, because he was vice president. There had never been an assassination of our beloved President Kennedy. Would you explain it, Grant? Well, the answer is the man in office now.
Within a week of the assassination, Lyndon Johnson had appointed a commission to investigate the death of his predecessor, which was chaired by the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren. The investigative responsibilities of the commission, however, would be delegated to the FBI, which was very successful in covering it up.
In this document, drafted on November 22nd, Dallas police inform FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover of other suspects in the assassination. Hoover dismisses the information prior to Oswald's even being charged. Clearly, minds have been made up hours after the event.
There was an editing process that Hoover went through where affidavits of individuals were altered, things of this nature. There was a lady who worked in the depository who in her original affidavit, she stated that she had seen Oswald as late as, I believe, 12:25 or later in the second floor lunchroom of the depository. This is just 5 minutes before well, actually, according to the published schedule, 12:25 was when the president's motorcade was supposed to be coming by the depository. Yet, in her final affidavit, the one that became public and so on at the time, stated that she had seen Oswald at 12:15 or later. And I think there were other individuals who later stated that the things that they said were not what appeared in the final affidavit. From the outset, like I say, they couldn't get cooperation from Hoover, and that's why they had to make the demand for raw data on December 16, 1963. And they, like everybody else, they were insiders. You imagine yourself in their situation. Here they've been appointed by the president to look into this thing, and they've been told by the president the man who's in charge of this is J. Edgar Hoover, and they're looking for the data, and he won't give them the data. I mean, in the same context, in the same time period, the president is making public statements strongly endorsing J. Edgar Hoover.
As the commission began their work, they faced several major problems. The rifle found in the book depository was not a high-velocity weapon, and the Army Ballistics Test Center reported 3 metal shims had to be placed under its telescopic sight to make it accurate enough just to test. FBI experts knew that Oswald's rifle could only fire every 2 seconds, and films of the assassination indicated the entire shooting took place in only 6 seconds. 3 shots were all that was allowable for one assassin, and that was pushing the time limit. A week after the assassination, the FBI had concluded that Kennedy had been struck by 2 bullets, and Texas Governor John Connally the 3rd.
The autopsy report from Bethesda Naval Hospital would maintain that the shot that hit the president in the back had exited his throat and gone on to damage Governor Connally, an hypothesis that became increasingly important, even crucial to the commission's findings, when it turned out that a distant bystander, James Tague, had been injured by a shot that had missed altogether. This placed the government in the awkward position of accounting for all of these wounds on the basis of only 2 bullets. The physicians at Parkland, moreover, and many other witnesses had observed a massive blow-up to the back of the head, so great that, in fact, brain tissue in large quantity was hanging out of the skull of the president.
They got this sheet unwrapped off the head. There was a big gaping hole in the right rear of the head back here by the scallop part. And he said in apparent surgery of the head, in the head area. So we made notes of this.
They also observed a small wound to the throat, through which a tracheostomy was performed in a vain attempt to assist the president in saving his life. That afternoon, the physician who had performed that tracheostomy, Malcolm Perry, at 3:16, told reporters that the president had been shot in the throat from in front, an observation he had made personally and which he repeated 3 times. Subsequently, in order to affect the government's official position supported by the evidence, Gerald Ford had the description of the wound to the back, which actually had entered 5.5 inches below the collar, changed to describe it as having entered at the base of the back of the neck.
He admitted this when the AARB people contacted him out in Vail, Colorado by phone. He admitted that he had made this change.
If you would believe these 2 agents and believe their testimony in their report, they do 2 things. Number 1 is they guarantee you and show you right there that there's a cover-up, because they see totally opposite of what the Warren Commission puts down in their final report. Number 2, you take the back wound that never exited the body, definitely didn't enter the neck and come out of the neck. You take away the magic bullet. If you take away the magic bullet, you have 4 shots. So basically they prove a conspiracy because they prove there's a 4th shot, and they prove there was a cover-up because they saw totally opposite or different things than the Warren Commission puts in their report.
Spector said Seibert said he didn't make any notes. And he said O'Neill made just a few and destroyed them. And when I read that, I could feel the heat coming up on the back of my neck. And I made the statement, and it's in the record, in the archives, that's a false statement.
What is so interesting about these 2 agents' testimony is, number 1, they wrote a report. The only people in that room that wrote a report. They can tell you every person that came in and out of that room, what happened. Both agents are talking centimeters and millimeters. And if you don't take notes, you can't possibly remember centimeters and millimeters. And this report was given to headquarters, FBI headquarters, on Tuesday, the day after the funeral. There is no doubt, completely no doubt, that J. Edgar Hoover read this report. Number 1, he had to. I mean, the interest of the death of a president of the United States, you know the director of the FBI is going to read the report. But I have confirmation of the fact that he did, because Tuesday to Thursday or Friday, he has a conversation with President Johnson and quotes the report as far as where the bullets were fired from, or in where they hit the body, and comments in that conversation. You could tell he read that report.
How many shots were fired?
3.
Any of them fired at me?
No,
all 3 at the president?
All 3 at the president, and we have them. 2 of the shots fired at the president were splinted, but they had characteristics on them so that our ballistic expert was able to prove that they were fired by this gun. The 3rd shot, which hit the president, he was hit by the 1st and the 3rd. The 2nd shot hit the governor. The 3rd shot is a complete bullet that wasn't shattered, and that rolled out of the president's head. It tore a large part of the president's head off.
This official story would later change to accommodate the single bullet theory.
Well, the interesting thing about that, you have 2 agents, his agents, present in an autopsy of the death of a president, and they don't testify before the Warren Commission. That is strange. Why? They travel all over the country. They try to grab every witness in Dealey Plaza, the ones they want to hear, and disregard the ones they don't want to hear. But you have 2 federal officers, federal agents, that don't testify before that Warren Commission. It's plain and simple. They didn't want to talk to them because they saw something totally different than what they wanted to hear.
Once they arrived at the conclusion, and that was done already the day of the death, the day of the autopsy, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a sole assassin, then everything had to fit. That all the shots had to come from back to front, from right to left, and from up downward. And no matter what they had found, it was going to be squeezed in. That's what gave birth to the single bullet theory. which has been attributed primarily to Arlen Specter, now U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, but which was then seized upon by everybody because they had to grab, as a drowning man floundering in a sea with tempestuous storms, they've got to grab at something to survive. They already had everything in place. How could they put this together? Well, they come up with the theory that the bullet that hit John Kennedy in the back, at its now new upward revised location, coursed through his upper chest, base of the neck area, emerged from the level of the knot of the tie, which is where the hole was that the pathologist had missed on the night of the autopsy, and then re-entered John Connolly's back, pierced his right lung, fractured the right fifth rib, destroying 4 inches of that bone, exited from the front of John Connolly's right chest, re-entered the back of John Connolly's right wrist, led to a comminuted or shattered fracture of the distal end of the radius, a very dense, heavy bone in a 6'4" guy like John Connolly, severed almost completely the radial nerve, which is the nerve that permits the thumb to hold something in apposition with the fingers, exited from the front of the governor's right wrist, re-entered the governor's left thigh, went down, struck the femur, the large bone from the hip to the knee, bounced back out, came out through the same small hole, a 1/4 of an inch or so in diameter in the skin, and then from his clothing onto a stretcher. And you see, that is the single bullet theory. That stretcher bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, that we critics refer to as the magic bullet, that is the hero of the Warren Commission report. That is the sine qua non. That is the linchpin, the keystone. Without the single bullet theory, you cannot have a sole assassin. My favorite picture of all the pictures, and it's one for which I take no credit, but it's the one that if I had to give up every single thing, including the Zapruder film, this is the one thing that I would hold on to that totally destroys them, and that is the pictures. It's a composite which they made, and to this day, I bet you they'd give anything not to have made that composite. It shows sample bullets fired into cotton wadding. It shows a sample bullet fired through a goat carcass breaking 1 rib, and it shows a sample bullet fired through a human cadaver breaking a radius. They had no bullets that broke both bones, as they claim the single bullet, 399, did. Well, when you look at the composite, the ball game's over. Let's go home. The case is over. Close up shop. The judge has just dismissed the case because the prosecution is giving us this evidence that shows that it can't be done. There is the stretcher bullet in all of its pristine grandeur. The bullets fired into cotton wadding have just as much deformity at the base. That's just from firing. A bullet fired through a goat carcass rib shows significant deformity, and a bullet fired through the radius of a human cadaver, forget about it. They have mushrooming, peeling back effect. In fact, some of the bullets fragmented. Don't forget, they took the bullets that in their minds and eyes were the least damaged. And that is their experiment, which shows that it can't be done.
Here are bullet fragments taken from Governor Connolly's body during his surgery following the JFK assassination. It is interesting to note that there are more fragments here than missing from the Commission's bullet. As can be seen in this X-ray of Governor Connolly's broken wrist, there were more metal fragments still in his body than are missing from the slug the Commission claimed caused the wound. This is also supposed to be the same bullet that passed through President Kennedy's neck, as depicted in this Warren Commission drawing. But the problem remained that no bullet ever passed through Kennedy's neck. The bullet that struck him from behind struck below the shoulder blades to the right of the backbone. This is clear from the bullet hole in both Kennedy's bloody shirt and jacket, and is shown in this official autopsy diagram. The original autopsy diagram was marked verified and signed by Kennedy's own personal physician, Dr. George Berkeley. Yet when published for the public, Berkeley's notation was deleted. Was the Warren Commission unaware of this discrepancy in the location of the back wound? Not according to this page from transcripts of the Commission's meeting held on January 27, 1964. Chief Consul J. Lee Rankin himself stated it was apparent that the wound was below the shoulder blades, well below the level of Kennedy's throat wound. He started to ask how it could turn in midair and move downward to strike Governor Connolly, but stopped, realizing this clear evidence disproving their single bullet theory was going on the public record. In this April 10, 1964 memorandum regarding Oswald's background, from a commission attorney to Rankin, it is stated that there are details that will require, quote, material alteration and, in some instances, omission. We can see that the Warren Commission knowingly omitted and altered vital evidence in the case. But what about the FBI, which was the primary investigative agency?
I was able to come across a lab report dated November 23rd, 1963. All the evidence that was gathered during the afternoon of November 22nd, gathered by the Dallas Police Department, was turned over to Special Agent Vincent Drain of the FBI in Dallas. He personally flew this evidence to the FBI lab. The FBI lab conducted their test, wrote their report, and returned the evidence on the same day, November 23rd, 1963. There were 2 spent shell casings given to the FBI from the Dallas Police Department, not 3. There was no prints found on the rifle that supposedly Oswald fired. On the inner part of the rifle, anywhere on the outside of the rifle, or even the clip, or the casings, or the bullet that was found in the rifle. There was no evidence to show that the brown paper the Warren Commission says he carried the rifle in that day. The lab did not find that the indentations of the folding wrapping paper matched the rifle, and they did not mention of any kind of oil on the paper that would have came from the rifle. This evidence was returned to Dallas on the afternoon or night of November 23rd, 1963. And it just so happens that on Monday, the fingerprints are found on the rifle. And also, I think it was Monday or Tuesday is when the 3rd casing shows up. That just so happened to be in the pocket of one of the police officers on the search.
Government documents show the assassination rifle was shipped back to Dallas on Sunday, November 24th, 1963, and that an FBI team spent a long time in the mortuary with Oswald's body the next day. Paul Grudy, the funeral home director, said years later that he was there when the FBI put that rifle in Oswald's dead hand. I had trouble getting the fingerprint ink off his hands in time for the burial, he said. Yet a blurry palm print belatedly produced by a Dallas police officer and identified as belonging to Oswald was instrumental in convincing the public of his guilt. Other seemingly strong evidence against Oswald fell apart under closer study. This Dallas police evidence sheet shows only 2 fired cartridges were recovered in the book depository. Days later, a 3rd cartridge conveniently turned up. The bottom of the evidence sheet carries a line showing a paraffin test on Oswald, indicating no gunpowder on his hands or face, only nitrates on his hands, which could have come from any number of sources. Yet this evidence supporting Oswald's innocence was deleted from the sheet as presented by the Warren Commission. Such mismanagement of evidence could not have been accomplished by Fidel Castro, or the Soviets for that matter. Only powerful forces within the federal government could have accomplished such acts of deception. The Warren Commission heard testimony that tied Oswald even closer to the FBI. Texas authorities told the commission they had developed evidence that Oswald was working as an informant for the Bureau. They gave his informant number, T179, and said he was being paid $200 a month. The Warren Commission declined to accept this information, although it may have explained reports of Oswald's cashing checks and money orders close to that amount.
In January '64, at Warren Commission executive session meetings, they were openly stating the fears that we have a situation here where Hoover is essentially telling us to pack up and go home and just issue a statement agreeing with him that there was just a lone nut.
By February of 1964, following a barrage of condemnation in the mass media, the whole nation was convinced of Oswald's guilt. Talk of conspiracy faded in every quarter except within the private conversations of Warren Commission members. By all accounts, the Warren Commission met behind closed doors, heard secret testimony, and brushed aside any evidence which did not support their predetermined verdict, that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. 3 of the commissioners, Cooper, Boggs, and Russell, all later reversed themselves and voiced doubts about the commission's conclusion that Oswald had committed the assassination alone.
The most shocking and disappointing aspect of the case was the lack of thoroughness and completeness of what the Warren Commission had done. It's mandated to tell the truth to the American people. When our government investigates, I cherish our government. I'm a believer in our system, and I've spent my career supporting our system. And as someone who served in the government, both as an assistant district attorney and as a mayor of a city and a city council, it's incumbent upon representatives of the people to tell the people the truth. And the Warren Commission didn't do that, and that to me is terribly regrettable.
The Warren Commission's report became the official government version, but it is not the only investigation that took place regarding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. In fact, the idea of multiple assassins became the last official position of the federal government in 1979, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations announced that, on the basis of 2 separate reports from acoustical scientists, at least 2 gunmen were involved, and therefore, quote, President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, unquote. The committee's conclusion added official weight to the many writers and researchers who for years had been claiming a conspiracy. Most Americans don't realize that the last official verdict of the U.S. government was one of conspiracy. An example of evidence pointing toward conspiracy is the account of Lieutenant Colonel Marvin, who claims he was asked by the CIA to kill Navy officer William Bruce Pitzer. Pitzer was present at Kennedy's autopsy and responsible for making films and photographs. There is evidence that Pitzer kept copies for himself, which he refused to release.
First of all, I was called up to Colonel C.W. Patton's office. He was my commanding officer of the 6th Special Forces Group. And I went up and he said, there's a company man waiting to meet you out under the pines. And there was one other officer there too. So we both walked towards the CIA officer from Colonel Patton's office. And when we got so close to him, I went ahead and the other fellow stayed back. And he had with him a piece of paper, and he handed it to me and had a name on it, William Bruce Pitzer. And he said, this man has got secrets that he's going to give to the enemy. And we'd like to have him taken care of. Would you like to do it? And I said, certainly. And I said, well, where is he located? Because I was on orders to go to Vietnam. So I assumed it was someplace outside the United States, because that's what we were told we'd do. And he said it was in Bethesda Naval Hospital, Bethesda, Maryland. And I said, I can't do that. I said, I got a wife and 3 children. I can't just all of a sudden disappear here in the United States like I'd have to in order for me to take care of that mission. And he said, you mean you refuse to do it? And I said, yes. But I said, you understand why? I said, you know what we were taught. And so he just dismissed me.
However, a year later, Pitzer was found in his office with a bullet in his head, and his death was quickly ruled a suicide.
Then, in 1993, they had a 30-year anniversary of JFK's assassination special. I was watching that program, and at the end of the program, they rolled a list of 42 names of men who had been involved one way or another in the assassination or its aftermath. And one of the names was Lieutenant Commander William Bruce Pitzer, and I about fell out of my chair. I got goosebumps all over me. And I said, he wasn't selling secrets to the enemy, he was doing something else. So I immediately set about, and with the help of a friend of mine, I located his widow, who still lived in Maryland. And I talked to her on the phone twice, recorded both times, and told her that I'd been asked to kill her husband and why. And she told me that he had the actual photographs of the Kennedy autopsy, both film and slides, and that she had been told by 4 different Navy intelligence officers to not talk to anybody, not even family, about her husband's death.
And are you a Marxist? Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers. But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Oh, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
A new witness, Judyth Baker, has emerged in the case. Baker contends that she enjoyed a relationship with Oswald that went beyond a passing friendship, and she can shed light into the dark corners of Oswald's activities, especially those in New Orleans during the summer of 1963.
Lee never in a million years was a real communist or a defector, a real defector. All of this, as most people should know by now, all of this was part of his dream to be a double agent, a secret agent.
A bright young man, Oswald's background was no more different than many other Americans in the 1950s until he entered the Marine Corps. While serving in Japan at the CIA's largest Asian base, Oswald was recruited into U.S. intelligence, according to several fellow Marines. A former CIA finance officer, James Wilcott, testified to the House Select Committee on Assassinations that based on his experiences in the Orient, including conversations with other CIA men, he believed that Oswald had worked for the agency while in Japan. Items found in Oswald's possession following the assassination also indicated intelligence work. His notebook mentioned microdots, a widespread spy technique for photographically reducing information to a small dot that can be hidden in mail or books. In light of Oswald's known interest in photography, his ownership of such a camera is not too unusual. However, it was determined that his camera carried a 5-digit serial number which did not exist among the Minox cameras distributed for commercial sale. Minox officials declared Oswald's camera carried an unregistered number, indicating it must have been issued by some government agency. If Oswald was not doing intelligence work, why did he possess a spy camera? All this supports Judyth Baker's claims that Oswald aspired to become a double agent.
He said, you know, when I was in New York, I led 3 lives, and it changed my life. And then he told me all about how he had seen this program with Herbert Philbrick, and that he had been a double agent, okay? And this inspired him incredibly.
In 1976, a CIA document surfaced stating that the agency considered Oswald for recruitment. This contradicted the sworn Warren Commission testimony of CIA official Richard Helms, who stated the agency had never even contemplated any contact with Oswald. This document, written by an unidentified CIA officer 3 days after Kennedy's assassination, states, "We showed intelligence interest in Oswald and, quote, discussed the laying on of interviews." A CIA 201 file on Oswald was discovered only in 1977. The existence of this file came to light after a Freedom of Information Act request was pressed by assassination researchers. At least 3 former CIA officers have stated publicly that the mere existence of a 201 or personnel file on Oswald indicated a relationship between the ex-Marine and the agency. The following quotation, written by respected military historian Dr. John Newman, clarifies Oswald's relationship with the CIA. Quote, "Within the labyrinth of Oswald's intelligence files at CIA headquarters is a set of papers which together demonstrate that the agency had a keen operational interest in Oswald's activities during the 8 weeks before the murder of President Kennedy. Newly released documents prove that the CIA was spinning a false yarn about Oswald before the assassination. The accused assassin of the president had been involved in very sensitive CIA operations. The CIA has doggedly withheld some of these details from the public view," unquote. If Oswald was working as a government agent, as the evidence indicates and his mother has always claimed, what was he up to? What was he doing on behalf of his intelligence handlers? Considered a whiz kid while she was still in grade school, Judyth Baker soon found herself in the shadowy world of military and intelligence services.
I can't prove the kind of things we were doing there, but I do know that, for example, I was working on a blood sedimentation project, and the purpose of it was if you injected live cancer cells into someone and applied this test to it, it would show whether or not the cells took. Now that's kind of serious stuff. Why in the world would you want to have such a material developed or such a test developed, and for what would it be used?
I have researched an entire collection of newspaper articles which were written about her back when she was still a high school student and somewhat of a superstar, because they were all expecting her to go out and find a cure for cancer. And I know that these documents are real. I've looked at the microfilm from the publication that they were published in, and there's no doubt in my mind that this woman is the same person I saw in the photographs and the articles were about. It is interesting to note that she was trained at a very early age for a very high level of laboratory work in terms of handling cancer-causing viruses.
Dr. Alton Ochsner, head of the American Cancer Society, recruited Judyth to work in Ochsner's cancer lab in New Orleans, Louisiana. Ochsner was a militant anti-communist, and the secret project Judyth was required for was the assassination of Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. While working for Ochsner, Baker met Lee Harvey Oswald, and soon a relationship developed between them.
As Lee and I talked, I learned a lot of things about him and about me. He told me I haven't been able to find anyone within light years with the same kind of interests as me, so many of them. I couldn't get my eyes off of him either. There was an attraction that was electric between us.
Her claim concerning knowing Lee Harvey Oswald, she has a number of original documents in her possession which show that she worked at the same company that Lee Oswald worked at, which was the Riley Coffee Company, that she started on the same day he started on, that she left the company on the same day that he left. And I think that is a pretty good collection of documents to support her claim that she knew Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in the summer of 1963.
Lee Harvey Oswald brought Judyth into contact with a string of unsavory characters in New Orleans. One of them, Guy Bannister, the former head of the Chicago FBI office, was involved with dealing arms to anti-Castro Cubans from his New Orleans detective agency. An associate of Bannister's was David Ferry, described by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison as, quote, one of history's most interesting individuals. Ferry was a brilliant eccentric, easily recognized by the wigs and painted eyebrows he used due to an unusual disease that left him hairless and bald. Ferry also was working in cancer research.
A laboratory was discovered by the investigative team working for District Attorney Jim Garrison during his investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And this was an underground medical laboratory which was reportedly using cancer-causing viruses to create cancer, located on Louisiana Avenue Parkway in the apartment of a man named David Ferry.
David Ferry had definitely penetrated into a ring that was serious, and all of his connections with the mob and everything were quite secure. However, he was our man. He was our man in the government.
But Judyth soon learned there was a dark and sinister side to this research.
I was given more information at this time on the kind of projects that they were thinking about to get rid of Castro, and there were numbers of ideas going around. But the one that Ochsner was interested in, and it was in his field, he was the expert par excellence. He was the #1 expert probably in the world on lung cancer. He'd already seen how the polio virus could kill someone. One of his ideas is that if we could just piggyback in on the SV40 virus, lung cancer, if we could give the cigar-smoking Castro lung cancer, and he could die quickly, and he had some evidence that we could do this with what's called galloping cancer.
Judyth's boss, Dr. Ochsner, was closely tied with the CIA-associated group Inca.
Inca was an organization called the Information Council for the Americas. This was essentially an anti-communist propaganda operation out of New Orleans, where they shipped tapes, anti-communist tapes, to radio stations all throughout Latin America. Inca was founded by Dr. Alton Ochsner, who was also the president of International House and an important member of the trade community in New Orleans. And the financing for Inca came primarily from Dr. Ochsner and from the business community of New Orleans. One of the most important people on the list was the owner of WDSU Radio and the owner of WDSU Television. This is important because these are the stations, the radio stations, that hosted the Oswald debates, and they were the stations that sent out the cameras to videotape Oswald handing out his leaflets. So there is an involvement with Ochsner, with Inca, and with Oswald going on in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. And we have a record album which was produced and released by Dr. Alton Ochsner concerning the radio debates involving Lee Harvey Oswald. And on the back of this record album is a photograph of Dr. Alton Ochsner where it points out that he was one of the few people in the listening audience who knew about, quote, Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union before the debate. Now, I want to ask the question directly. This man was the president of the American Cancer Society. What is the president of the American Cancer Society doing getting tangled up with Lee Harvey Oswald?
As a cover for their cancer research, both Judyth and Lee Harvey Oswald were given work at a New Orleans coffee company.
And they had someone over at William B. Riley Company, which was a member of Inca, and they were all good friends. The whole Riley family was, with Dr. Ochsner and Butler and all of these people. They were all working together. There were a lot of money was running back and forth and supporting Ochsner's anti-communist activities. And in the Riley Company, they only hired the finest people that were anti-communist. They were anti-Castro, and then they had pristine reputations. Lee Oswald is hired by Riley he's got a bad Marine record by now. He's been to Russia. He has a Russian wife, and he, on the surface, has been a Marxist, someone who was a defector. He is being hired by the same company that won't let anybody in who has a breath of nastiness about them. And here, Lee Oswald is hired without any problem. After a brief interview on May 9th, he's hired on May 10th.
With Judyth covering his absences, Lee Oswald would slip through a next-door garage where government cars were parked and journey on to the nearby office of Guy Bannister or to the cancer lab in Ferry's apartment. On more than one occasion, the garage owner saw Oswald and government men handing off envelopes to each other. Chauncey Holt, through his work with the CIA, was ordered to create a series of pro-Castro leaflets for Lee Harvey Oswald.
Sometime between April and June of '63 was when we first delivered the first documents and the first leaflets that we delivered to Oswald.
First of all, he was posing as pro-Castro, and he had a very good reason. What the problem was is there were 3 ships that were coming in from Colombia or Venezuela, I can't remember anymore, and they wanted to unload this ship that was coming in, and it looked like boxes of furniture. In the bottom of these boxes of furniture were guns, and they took them out through New Orleans to various vendors who were really anti-Castro people, and that's how they were getting their guns. Lee was involved in this, and he actually pamphleted the WASP is because we had stevedores. A lot of them were Cuban, worked together. We didn't know who was pro-Castro and who was anti-Castro, and by handing out the pamphlets, they were photographed and noted across the street while who took them and who didn't, because a number of stevedores and dock workers took these pamphlets, and if they did, they were not allowed to unload this ship.
We were advised that Oswald, who was going to give out hand out these leaflets, needed a little moral support, needed a little steel in there, and so we went over to create a presence there. The only thing we knew at that time about Oswald was we had detected the address on there as being 544 Camp Street. We were not familiar with Oswald at all. We certainly knew what was at 544 Camp Street because we had been there before. Guy Bannister had an office in the building, although he used an address around the corner, but he was in that same building. So we made the connection that way, but as far as who Oswald was, we just assumed it was some kind of a disinformation program because Oswald's name was on documentation. It wasn't his picture. Others had his picture and his name Although at that time we never seen Oswald, we didn't know which one was the real guy. He started handing out the pamphlets, and we were right in anti-Castro country. You know, people were coming and going. Some of them seemed to be just passerbys. Some seemed to be rather had an unusual interest in it, as though they were part of the group.
On August 9th, Lee was arrested for handing out pamphlets, and I had gone over there from Riley, I was still working at Riley, to hand him some that I had trimmed that had been printed crooked. And these are bright yellow, you couldn't miss them. And the other thing I did is I kind of encouraged him, and you know, I couldn't kiss him in public, but I squeezed his hand. And then I had to leave. But some people saw me with him because a crowd had started gathering, and he got arrested at that time, and this had already been planned a long time ago.
While passing out flyers on Canal Street, Lee Harvey Oswald was confronted by anti-Castro activist Carlos Bringuier. The altercation that occurred may not have been what it seemed to be. Oswald appeared to be quite jovial after his arrest, and according to Chauncey Holt, Bringuier was not that upset either.
When Carlos Bringuier came down there, he didn't seem to be very serious about really whipping Oswald real bad. It seemed like a joke to him. At the time, I thought, well, maybe it was really contrived.
Oswald was released from jail the next day to the custody of Emil Bruneau, an associate of Carlos Marcello, and Lee's uncle, Dutz Morant.
Lee knew Carlos Marcello not only by sight, but could converse with him. Marcello had known him ever since he was a little boy, running around when Lee's mom was dating Marcello's own chauffeur. While Lee was not working directly for Marcello, both Bannister and Marcello liked the idea that he could move freely between either of them and be able to get along. He was like trusted and respected by Bannister and his associates, and by David Ferry and his associates, which were the mob.
These incidents appear to have been the beginning of the framing of Lee Harvey Oswald.
As time drew on, he recognized more and more that he was being set up and other things were happening. He was aware of some of these problems, that he wasn't being handled correctly and with the right respect. One time he was even exposed as to identity to another person that he shouldn't have been. And these concerns bothered him.
According to Judyth, Lee was sent to Mexico City to deliver the cancer cells for the assassination of Fidel Castro to a mysterious man named Mr. B. But a hurricane hit the island of Cuba and made all contact impossible.
And Mr. B, he was supposed to meet in Mexico City. Mr. B is someone who could have been Frank Bender, or it could have been Benson, another name that David Atlee Phillips used.
In the 1950s and 1960s, Phillips was the CIA case officer for the anti-Castro Cubans in Havana and Mexico City. The star of David Atlee Phillips rose to CIA Director of Special Operations in his own backyard. Phillips was called to testify for the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s. Several members of the committee wanted to call him again, for they believed he had not told the truth and committed perjury. One of them was Robert Tenenbaum.
I left the House committee when it became clear to me, and Richard Sprague, who was chief counsel and a brilliant lawyer, an honest man. We came to the realization, after the investigation I was conducting and reporting directly to Sprague and the committee and the chairman, who was also a very good man, Louis Stokes, who was the congressman from Cleveland, Ohio, that the committee as a whole was not really interested in finding out the truth. And one of the areas, of course, that came up that disappointed me was the recalling of David Phillips, and there were other matters as well.
I've had an occasion to now review the evidence that has been gathered by Zach. We'd already crossed the threshold of predication, reason to investigate. After reviewing the evidence and information, in my opinion, it has reached the point which I would call probable cause. We have got to go over that information, realize that maybe certain mistakes were made. Maybe there were certain agendas that had to be taken care of for national security. Well, now is the time for truth to come forward.
The man that killed Kennedy was James Files. James Files was a member of the Giancana team as a young man, and his immediate boss was Chucky Nicoletti, and Nicoletti's boss, of course, was Sam Giancana. Nicoletti was very much an intrinsic part of Sam's outfit right here in Chicago.
Jimmy Sutton was born in Alabama in 1942. He had the name Sutton, which he later changed to James Files. He lived in Alabama for this first 7 or 8 years of his life. Then he moved to the south side of Chicago. In approximately 1958, 1959, Jimmy decided to join the Army. He was then shipped to Vietnam. He was ultimately in Laos and Cambodia. In 1960 to 61, Jimmy, while back in the United States, was recruited, while he was still James Sutton, was recruited by David Atlee Phillips for the Central Intelligence Agency. After Jimmy finished with his basic military, he came back to the south side of Chicago, and he ran across a couple gentlemen that he'd grown up with, and one of them being that he had later met by the name of Charles Nicoletti.
In approximately 1979 or 1980 in Chicago, I had an investigation involving James Files. In this investigation, I identified the fact that Files was hijacking tractor-trailer loads of merchandise and bringing them to Chicago and selling them. We were able to purchase 3 of these loads, and with conversation that we had with Files, it was known that he was definitely a, say, not a godchild, but basically a really running buddy of Chuck Nicoletti's. Also at that same time, Files was involved in a chop shop operation and was bringing these vehicles down to Dallas, Texas. Through this investigation, I was able to come very close to an individual that Files knew, and this individual told me that once in Dallas, Texas, they went through Dealey Plaza. Files became very weird, made a comment to the effect that if the American people really knew what happened, no one would be able to handle it. This statement, I felt, was definitely made, or this individual wouldn't have told me this. The question then was, why did Files make that statement?
Joe West was a private investigator whose investigation of the assassination began in 1989. In 1992, West met former FBI Special Agent Zach Shelton.
I told Joe West about this comment that Files had made in 1979 and told him if he really wanted to check up on a good lead, he should find Files, and at that time I knew Files was incarcerated somewhere in the United States.
Initially, Files was very reluctant to talk to Joe West.
When Joe West first originally contacted me here at Stateville Prison, I was on a visit. The counselor came in the visiting room where I was at and stated that she wanted me to come out and make a phone call. I told her, I said, no way, I'm here 365 days a year. I'm not leaving my visit to go make a phone call. I said, who's calling? She told me, someone from Texas named Joe West. I told him, I do not know the party. I said, tell them I'll call them on my time, not their time. I'm on a visit. Don't bother me when I'm on a visit. The next day, they got me out of my cell. They took me downstairs and got a phone call hooked up.
Initially, Files was very reluctant to talk to Joe West. Slowly and meticulously, West established a relationship with Files. Through months of personal visits and detailed correspondence, Files began to reveal his participation in the JFK assassination, but would only confess if he were granted immunity from prosecution. West was negotiating immunity from Texas authorities when he became ill and suddenly passed away in 1993. As Files had come to respect Joe West, his death was a major factor in his willingness to come forward with the confession that West had been seeking from him.
And we know how much effort, at least we have some idea about the effort of the FBI and the CIA in trying to minimize or marginalize James Files, to try to make him to be, somebody wanting only attention, that he had nothing to do with the assassination. Poor guy's in jail, he wants people to think about him, and therefore he claimed that he was part of the Giancana team. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. James Files wanted no attention whatsoever.
There is reason for a reasonable person to believe further in-depth investigation is required. And that this investigation is required not only to answer the question that are in millions of the minds of the American people to this very day of what happened, but also to answer the questions in further in-depth that Zach's investigation has presented.
As far as who was in Dallas, Texas on the day of the November 22nd, 1963, we have James Files, Chuck Nicoletti, Charles Nicoletti, who was one of the top sub-bosses in the Chicago mob, and also Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli was the link between the mob and the CIA at that particular time. And on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Tosh Plumlee flew into Dallas, Texas with John Roselli.
Robert Tosh Plumlee had a long record of working with both the CIA and the military. His involvement goes all the way back to the 1950s. In the 1980s, he appeared to testify at the Iran-Contra hearings, where he said he was a pilot for the CIA.
Then you have individuals such as Chauncey Hope, who received a letter from Peter Licavelli to come to the Grace Ranch and pick up Lips, another mob associate out of Detroit, and also Chucky, who was Chuck Nicoletti. Chauncey Hope stated that he drove both of these individuals to Dallas and arrived approximately late night of the 21st or early morning of the 22nd.
What had been a plot to kill Castro turned to a plot to kill Kennedy with a ready-made fall guy by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. With Kennedy's failure to provide air cover during the Bay of Pigs invasion, his unwillingness to invade Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis created a convergence of interests aligning anti-Castro Cubans, the Mafia, and the CIA, who now felt that they would be better off with Kennedy out of the way, and the stage was set for the assassination of the president.
Lee was aware, I think in April, that there was an either-or situation that was developing. Either Castro goes out or Kennedy goes out.
I was sitting in the Harlow Grill that evening, playing the pinball machine, and Charles Nicoletti walked in, a man that I did a lot of work with. And he walked in the back room where I was at, says, "Jimmy, let's go." I said, "I'll be with you in a minute." He reached over and tilted the machine and said, "Let's go now." My reply was, "Yes, sir, Mr. Nicoletti." I knew he wasn't in no mood to wait and hang around. He said, "I want to talk to you." I went out, I got in his car, and we went for a ride. And we went for a ride, and he told me, he says, "We're going to do a friend of yours, President Kennedy, JFK." And at this point, I still kind of thought, he was just joking with me. But then he got real serious about it. And then we started talking, and he told me, he says, "What I'm going to want you to do," he says, "I'm going to look around." He says, "We'll search the area around the town here." He says, "You know everything pretty good," he says, "and see where we're going to do it at, what kind of weapons we're going to need, and other things like that," he says. And he mentioned, he said he was going to bring Johnny Roselli in on it.
So I knew John Roselli rather well. I've flown John Roselli, I would say, perhaps more than 6 or 7 different occasions. The last part of 60, first part of 61. And this was at Biscayne Park. We just came from a meeting place called Sloppy Joe's on Flagler Street in Miami. And John Firentello was the person that introduced me to John Roselli.
I was well aware that Johnny Roselli was involved in the government actions. He was like the license between CIA and organized crime, and he was heavily involved in the invasion of Cuba, Bay of Pigs, Chianos Bay, whichever you prefer to call it. But he was also very tight with Frank Sturgis. Frank Sturgis headed up the SAO, which is a secret Army organization.
After the incident with Oswald in August of '63, there was a frenzy of activity, especially in September, of producing. We had unusual orders for documents.
When Lee was hired at what's called the Texas State Book Depository, that thing was all set up. And Mr. Truly, who was there, thought Lee was working for the FBI. He didn't realize that he might be working for someone else, or it might be some other connection. That whole thing was set up ahead of time.
But when the time come, and we knew that it was going to be serious, and we were going to, Chuck was sending me to Texas.
We were asked in November to produce a whole range of documentation, including Secret Service documentation, a certain number of pens which they could wear. And we were told that we had to be in Dallas on the night of November 21st.
I went down like a week before the assassination. I made 2 telephone calls when I got there. I called Charles Nicoletti, told him that I was on the scene and where I was at in case he had to reach me. I turned around and made another phone call. I called David Atlee Phillips because he always had to know where I was at because he was my controller. CI purposes, special operations, or something that might be needed done.
Meanwhile, Lee was telling me, as we had our various phone calls, which were usually at night during the weekdays, and various names were brought up, and I remember Roselli. And one of the last things Lee told me was that I should not forget the name of David Atlee Phillips.
Phillips was traced as a suspect as a result of the testimony of Cuban exile leader Antonio Veciana, a friend of Files who knew his CIA case officer only under the alias Maurice Bishop.
He was pretty much convinced that the man he met sometime in September in Dallas, who was identified to him at that time as Mr. Bishop, was probably David Atlee Phillips.
David Atlee Phillips' whereabouts on November 22, 1963, that were confirmed by his brother James Phillips. James stated that his brother admitted to him that he was in Dallas on the day of the assassination.
James J. Canty was the pilot that was coming with me to simply fly the plane back with me. We stopped off in Tucson at Pete Licavoli's ranch, and Charlie Nicoletti and Leo Masuri wanted to make the drive with us, and we would all alternate in the driving so we could drive straight through. We had been told that an incident was going to be created which could be laid at the door of the pro-Castro Cubans. The word attempted assassination was never used.
The last phone call I received from Lee was Wednesday, November 20th. At this particular time, he or David Ferry later, one of them, either he told me or David told me later, that he was part of an abort team, a team that was trying to stop the assassination.
2 days before the assassination, a woman named Rose Chermy, a dancer in one of Jack Ruby's nightclubs, was set to pick up a shipment of narcotics. She was later found dumped on the roadside and brought to the Louisiana State Hospital in Jackson, where she informed doctors that President Kennedy was to be assassinated the following day, that the word was out throughout the New Orleans underworld that a contract had been placed on the president. When the doctors informed the Dallas police after the assassination, Dallas police responded they had no interest and had found their man.
Our team flew out of West Palm Beach, a place called Lantana, to Tampa, and then Rosselli and a couple other people got on board in Tampa. We flew to New Orleans, where 2 people got off, 3 other people got on. Rosselli stayed on board. We flew to Houston, and then the next morning we had some weather, and then we left for Dallas. We were heading for Redbird Airport, and we had to make a stop at Dallas Garland because of weather. We were military intelligence. The CIA was running support and coordinating certain flights, making different arrangements or necessary arrangements for us. The impression that I was under at that time, we were flying a team into Dallas to abort the assassination, and John Rosselli was on board that flight, as well as a couple other Cubans and people that were connected with organized crime in New Orleans.
We have a brilliant sun at this moment. The wind has diminished considerably, and it has turned into a comfortable situation for the hundreds of people who came here to Dallas Love Field. Here is the presidential jet, U.S. Air Force number 1, printed on the side. And there is Mrs. Kennedy, the First Lady, stepping from the plane, and the President steps off directly behind.
We didn't arrive in Dallas until early the following morning, on the morning of the 22nd, for the simple reason that we had some car trouble, we hit bad weather, and it took us longer to drive it. We were supposed to deliver all the documents. We were supposed to put them in a pickup truck. They had already identified the pickup truck with a camper shell, had Texas license plates on it, and was supposed to be at the cabana. If that didn't work out, if we had any kind of delay for any reason, the pickup truck was going to be in the parking lot at Dealey Plaza. And that's where we found it.
And here comes the president now. He is reaching across the fence, shaking hands.
Johnny Roselli, we was on the way to Fort Worth, and I asked him, I said, when did you get in? He said, I got in this morning. He said, I got in early this morning. He said, I hadn't been here a couple hours. And I said, how'd you get in? He said, I got lucky. I flew in on a MATS. I said, MATS. And for people who don't know what a MATS is, that's Military Air Transport Service. And he said he got lucky. He caught a ride on a plane that's sponsored by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. I said, how the hell did you manage that one? He said, I got lucky. He's had somebody there. I didn't ask no more. He didn't elaborate any more than that. I didn't dig any deeper than that.
James Files, who has never met Tosh Plumlee, confirms that Johnny Roselli was sent in to abort the assassination.
I hadn't seen Chuck in person until I went with Johnny Roselli to Fort Worth and come back. Johnny Roselli got out of the car, went upstairs. Charles Nicoletti come down. Mr. Nicoletti got in the car with me, and we drove to Dealey Plaza.
There's the gunmetal gray limousine, blue and gray. The President and Mrs. Kennedy seated on the back seat, Governor and Mrs. Connolly on the second seats or jump seats, and then the official driver and Secret Service men are in the front seat.
While we're walking around, Charles Nicoletti asked me, he says, how do you feel about being backup? I said, what do you mean backup? He says, how would you feel about being backup as a shooter for me? I said, what happened to Johnny? What's with Johnny? And he said, Johnny's a little bit paranoid on this. He says, the CA's called the hit off. He said, they don't want the hit to go down. And I said, well, what'd you say? Chuck's exact words were, it's going anyway. And I told him, I said, well, what about Johnny? He said, well, Johnny's good. Johnny will be with me, he says, but he's not going to be a shooter. He said, he doesn't want to go against the orders. He said, he's been told he flew in here specifically to abort this assassination.
It will go Mockingbird Lane to Lemon Avenue, then travel south on Lemon to Turtle Creek, Cedar Springs, through the downtown area on Harwood to Maine, west on Maine to Houston, through the Triple Underpass to Stemmons Freeway, then on to the Trade Mart.
Lee told me the attempt to kill Kennedy would be either at the airport when he got off the plane, except that he said there was so much exposure there it might not work, or it was going to be at Dealey Plaza, or it was going to be at the Trade Mart. Those three areas, locales. And he believed it would be at Dealey Plaza because of the setup and the location of everything. It was just perfect in his consideration.
I was taken over to the safe house that was located in Oak Cliff right next to the country club on Bar Harbor Drive. And that's where we congregated. And then from there we went directly in a car down to the plaza and was dropped off. And our objective there on the plaza was to go in and be spotters to try to stop cross-triangulation gunfire on an ambush. We had people that filtrated out into the plaza, and the object there was to get next to anyone that possibly could have been a shooter and take them out.
Our instructions were very generalized and in some respects actually bizarre looking back on it. We were told that, look, there may be a lot of confusion here, and if there's anything goes wrong, that sitting on the siding would be this train. They identified the number of the Rock Island train. They said that the train apparently be locked on one side, but on the other side that it would be unlocked. The train would not be searched. We could go into the train and we would be concealed.
After I took Charles Nicoletti back to the hotel, I went back to the plaza, secured the car, got my briefcase out with a gun in it with a fireball in it. I went into the railroad yard. I secured that over there, put it away so nobody see it. Reversed my jacket inside out. I'd taken my hat, great door like.
We, at this point, came down, and at that time, the motorcade was about turning, or maybe halfway between the county jail and the turnoff, right through there. Sergio and I came over here, looked at these light posts here, decided, okay, if we had a shooter, more than likely he would be right along in here, using the left or the right side of these posts as a reference points for timing or whatever. And then we observed the rest of what the motorcade as it came around.
The time we're in the parking lot back near the railroad tracks, back of the Grassy Knoll. As a matter of fact, we can't even see the motorcade.
The President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark.
Motorcade come down, I believe that's Main Street there, come down on Houston, turn back around onto Elm there, and come down that little side drive there. Oh, when it come down and made its first right, that's when I brought the weapon up. And then I'm over the fence, and as they come down, made the turn on down there, that's when I started focusing through the scope and following the car.
And we noticed a lot of commotion as it started coming into view. And then the shots came out, and that's when all hell broke loose.
I've got this sign there for the Simmons Freeway that is fixing to come into my field of fire. As far as I can see at this point, the President has not been hit in the head at this time. I've seen the body lurch. I know he's been hit. How serious, I don't know. But my last instructions was we're going for a headshot. If you have to take a shot, take it, but don't fire unless it's a necessity, unless you really have to. Well, I was aiming for his right eye, which to me is the left side of his head looking head on. But for him, it would be his right eye. And when I pull the trigger, I'm right in on it, and it's almost like looking 6 feet away through the scope. As I squeezed, take off my round, his head moved forward, I missed, and I coming right along the temple, just right behind the eye. I fired one shot only.
And at this point right here, I remember seeing Kennedy's head going way back like that.
What I believe is, and I did not see, let me clear the fact now, I never saw Mr. Nicoletti shoot Kennedy, but I know he was the man in the Dow Tech building, the man supposed to be doing the shooting. Therefore, the head started forward. As far as I'm concerned, Mr. Nicoletti hit him at that point. As I squeezed off my round, the head started forward, I hit it and blew the head backwards.
And Sergio turned to me. He said, "Oh my gosh, we effed up. Let's get the hell out of here." And so at this point, I turned like this and then made a step to come up and around. And Sergio was about right along here. And we went up here. There was a gentleman down here in a parked car, a truck. As we got to about this area, he hollered something to Sergio. Sergio was maybe a little bit down. He says, "It looks real bad." And then we continued to proceed up through this way, just casually walking like we were going to go back over where the crowd was congregating, going to that section right there. There was a few congregation up there at the deal. I looked back once or twice in time to see the limousine go under the triple underpass.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by.
We continued on over here, and this picket fence was up, and there was a little opening right through here. And when we got to this point right here, we did smell gun smoke. And we felt that maybe that gun smoke had drifted because of the north wind across here for the time span it took us to get from the light post to this intersection right here. We definitely picked up a good solid smell of gunpowder.
The minute all these shots were fired, we knew that something had gone awry. We didn't know why, But from all the screaming and carrying on, we knew that there had been one hell of a bad incident. And at that time, it ran through our mind that, hey, we've gotten ourselves into something that's way over our head. So I hot-footed it through, scooted under the train, went over to the other side, encountered Harrelson and Montoya. We searched out for the car, which was not too far from the engine, climbed in it, closed the door, and sat there in silence.
I knew Dave was going to call, and it rang, and I answered. And on the other end, I hear panic-stricken David Ferry like I've never heard before. And he's even crying and weeping, and everything had gone wrong. Everything that possibly could have gone wrong had gone wrong. And he was aware of what had happened to Lee. He said that they were going to get mob lawyers to get him out. They could spring him. He hadn't yet been, there was hope because he hadn't been actually blamed for the death of the president.
Then suddenly they opened the door, and there was a whole pass of police officers there, shotguns, everything else. They took us out. We tried to identify ourselves, and we said, "Hey, we're federal agents. We're working on this thing," and they said, "Well, come with us," and we strolled along. News reports were constant about the assassination, who had been shot. We learned that we'd already learned that the president was dead before we left. We learned that Connolly was going to survive. We learned that according to the news reports, that the assassin, whose name they gave us, had been captured. At that time, of course, we realized that we were involved to some extent, and of course the county wasn't privy to as much information as I was, and we just simply discussed the thing. And at that point, I told him that that I was sure that Oswald had been set up.
Sergio and I at least felt that we went in to abort, or with a team to abort. However, with the view of the fact that the people that was on board that aircraft and the contact that I'd had with organized crime in Miami and Nevada, and the people that were on board that aircraft at that time, I don't rule out the possibility that we could have possibly flown the attack team in. Over the years, I've tried to sidestep that issue. I haven't came forward and came out too public about that. And I thought I'd let the investigators do their work, which obviously nowadays they have done some fantastic work.
I have been looking into the assassination of JFK, have tried to verify Files' story. A lot of that story I have been able to verify.
We first of all get an inkling in 1992 with Chuck Giancana and his son, Sam Jr., in their book, where we have a very clear picture of Sam Giancana's involvement in the assassination. But then we do have the taped confession of James Files in 1996, and then after that we have the extended tape. And those of us in Chicago have looked at that tape many times, including Antoinette Giancana's husband, and we find that everything that Files has said about every member of the Giancana team is consistent with everything we knew. In fact, there are many, many facts that I have learned from James Files in his confession and I have never found a single time that he had lied.
I was in the motel, the Lamplighter Inn in Mesquite, Texas, that he said he stayed in prior to the assassination and during the assassination and left. The House Select Committee in 1978 went back to Dallas, Texas, and conducted a series of acoustics tests based on the open mic of the motorcycle cop in the caravan that day with Kennedy. And basically their conclusion was that there were definitely 4 shots, that there was one shot from the Grassy Knoll and you can go to the exact spot where the shooter took the shot. And what's interesting about where they say the shot came from is exactly where Files stated he was standing. And exactly at the same spot of a, I wouldn't want to say figure, in the famous Mary Mormon photograph. If you would enlarge that as much as you can without losing what you could see, there's something there. There's something there that shouldn't be there. And that's exactly the same spot the house, or the acoustics test supposed to shoot is, exactly where Files said he was standing. So it has to be something. And this particular photograph was taken exactly split second after Kennedy got shot in the head.
During his interviews, Files spoke of a .222 shell casing he ejected from his Remington XP-100 Fireball, an experimental gun Files said was given to him by David Atlee Phillips. A Texas man named John Rodemaker and his son discovered this .222 caliber shell casing on the Grassy Knoll in 1987.
I found the first shell casing 6 feet towards the end of the fence and 6 feet off the picket fence, right before the stairs goes down to Elm Street.
The dating of Rodemaker's findings is corroborated by anthropologist Gary Hughes, who stated that according to archaeological dating techniques, the shell casing is consistent with a 1963 deposition date, and by the manufacturer's markings on the casing, which indicate the date of production being before 1971.
I took this shell casing as it come out to the briefcase, closed the briefcase up, and as I stood up, I did something I shouldn't have done, but I did do it. I took the shell casing, I bit down on it. I took it out and I looked at it, and I set it on the stockade fence. And there was an indentation from my teeth on the shell casing on the ridge by the orifice. Mr. Nicoletti would laugh at me when I do things like that, and hey, you know, we gotta let them know what they got here for, you know. To me, it was a symbol. Say it, calling card, trait, whatever you want to do. He used to laugh at me over it. He told me, Jimmy, just you do the job, you do it, and forget about it. If he would have known I did that in the Dealey Plaza, right now he's probably turning over in his grave for me doing something that stupid.
In 1993, Dr. Paul G. Stimpson, a dental forensic expert at the University of Texas at Houston, wrote this letter concluding that marks on the .222 shell casing were indeed human dentition teeth marks. He identified the teeth as the right central and lower right central incisors. Since there has never been any publicity on the dents in the shell casing, and nobody knew what they were, it is impossible that James Files could have known that a dent mark was on the shell casing, unless he put it there himself.
There's another line of evidence also for this shot to the right front, and that comes from one of the technicians at the autopsy. After the autopsy doctors were done, then the morgue personnel came in and tried to restore Kennedy to a presentable appearance, and apparently they were quite successful. But Tom Robinson, who was one of these technicians, describes how he saw a small hole in the right forehead near the hairline. He had to plug this hole to keep the embalming fluid from coming out. That's pretty striking. So we have multiple lines of evidence, the x-rays, the photographer, Tom Robinson. We have even some clues from Parkland itself that there was a bullet entry wound in the right forehead. So we have this whole sequence of events strongly suggesting, particularly the x-rays, that there was a shot to Kennedy's right forehead from the front. So none of that information, none of that evidence was in the official autopsy report, and it was not in the Warren Commission report. So I'm quite convinced today that Kennedy was in fact hit twice in the head. Once from the right rear, just as the official report says, but then after that, he was hit a second time in the head from the right front, the bullet passing right at the hairline above his right eye. So that's probably the major disagreement on the headshots, that there were 2 instead of 1 in the Warren Commission report, and that one of those shots to the head came from the front.
Further evidence from an article by Dr. David Mantic sheds new light on the case and support Files' claim that he was the shooter. Mantic claims that the X-rays of Kennedy's brain and skull fragments indicate traces of mercury. Files says he fired the fatal shot with a mercury round. Furthermore, Files' story can be verified by the confession of Chauncey Holt and the corroboration of the activities surrounding events at Dealey Plaza.
A lot of Chauncey Holt's story is verified with witnesses in Dealey Plaza, as far as the station wagon he was driving being sighted by the witness in the top of the tower at the railroad yard. James Files stating that Chuck Nicoletti was in Dealey Plaza that day.
Files' confessions came before Chauncey Holt's revelations about driving Nicoletti to Dallas, so it is impossible for Files to have drawn upon Holt's story or Tosh Plumlee's account of flying Johnny Roselli and his mission to abort the assassination. Files could not have either spoken to them or read their confessions. Files' story is based on his own memories about the assassination, and it is corroborated by both Holt and Plumlee. This cannot be a coincidence.
Jimmy Files had pinpointed precisely events that led up and chronicalized him being there and things that could only be determined later on. Those things to me support it. Other than that, it too is perhaps my 40-year friendship with Jimmy. I've never directly tried to catch Jimmy in a lie. I had no need to. He was a friend that came forward and over time has told me numerous things, none of which has ever been countermanded, none of which was ever proven wrong, and I never sought this.
Now, concerning the three tramps who
Lois Gibson works for the Houston Police Department and is probably the most respected forensic artist and facial expert in the world. She's been awarded a notation in the Guinness Book of World Records for the highest crime-solving rate based on composite sketches. She identifies Chauncey Holt as one of the arrested tramps who were released by the Dallas police. She also verifies Holt's claim that he was present when Lee Harvey Oswald distributed flyers in New Orleans.
Several individuals have been wrongly accused of having been the tramps. Possibly some of them deserve to be accused of that or something else. And I specifically referred to someone like Frank Sturgis, who incidentally ran afoul of the law for something else and ended up in prison. Howard Hunt, that was falsely identified as the person that I claimed to be. You see there's a lot of mystery surrounding the assassination. I felt that my information is from a point of view that would probably, if I am believed, it would lay to rest these ideas that Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald were just nuts that passed in the night. And that I always felt a sympathy for Oswald. And I just don't feel it's right that he would be, or his children, should be stuck with that stigmatism, that's all.
Tried so hard to hide the real facts behind it too, that I think right now the count has gone up to 102 people have had one kind of mysterious death or another that were related to trying to get out the truth about the Kennedy assassination, including the man I was asked to kill.
after reviewing all this information. I must admit that I tried to hold myself independent of my emotions. I counseled Zach to do the same. But it is difficult to so insulate yourself that the humanity within me and within Zach are hurt. I'm hurt. And it's a difficult thing to mentally deal with. But I can only see the solution for all of us is the truth, the facts.
It's important to find the truth about who murdered the president because there was an official governmental investigation. And it seems to me as one humble American, very proud of being an American, that when the government investigates who assassinated our precious president, that we find out. And at the very least, if we can't find out, we tell the American people what we did find out during the course of the investigation and the reasons why we weren't able to find out exactly what happened. And that should have been done, and it wasn't done. And since the government was involved in trying to find it out, it remains very important that the truth be told to the American people.
To my personal way of thinking, I think the state of Texas, perhaps the Attorney General, should impanel a grand jury with all the legal power and authority of a grand jury to at least satisfy their legal jurisdiction of a murder case. This grand jury should have the authority to go after whatever information is necessary to gather, whatever witnesses need to be interviewed, and charge whatever people, regardless of their station in life, with violations of any crimes that may have been committed. And it basically let the chips fly where they may.